Mike McDaniel and Chris Grier had their end of the season press conference early in the day. And all I got to say is, wow, there's so many things to unpack from what was said that it's hard to figure out where to begin. But I guess I'll start with Chris Grier since he's been with the organization the longest. Chris Grier said, and he openly admitted that, while he stands by his statement that he made early in the offseason, that they're not really worried about the offensive line as much as maybe the media and the fans were. He does admit that the Dolphins need to work on the offensive line in the offseason. It's going to be a priority for them. It has to be a point of emphasis. And as a Dolphin fan, that's something that you want to hear, something you have to be optimistic about, is finally confronting the problem, the elephant in the room. But Chris Grier said the reason why he was so convicted about the guys that were there last year is because they led the league in rushing the year before. And they had hopes that even though they lost Robert Hunt, that some of the guys that they brought in would take the next step to become the players that they envisioned them being. And that they believed in the offensive line coach, Butch Barry, that he was going to bring out the best in those players. Now, I like Butch Barry. I think Butch Barry is a good offensive line coach. But all coaches, no matter how good they are, they still need some talent to work with. And I'm not sure if Chris Grier gave Butch Barry the type of talent that he needed to make this a competent, if not an elite offensive line. So Chris Grier seems like he did kind of take responsibility for that, but he also kind of put the blame on the players, saying that he expected them to perform better. And he also kind of put the blame on Butch Barry, saying that he expected they believed in the coach, so therefore the coach was expected to make those players better. So right there, it seems as though Chris Grier is kind of passing the buck on the offensive line coach and also on the players that they didn't get it done. It wasn't Chris Grier's fault. So that's the first thing. The next thing Chris Grier said was that, these guys practice all day long. They're the last ones to practice. No other unit in the building practices more than the offensive line. And in a vacuum, you'd say to yourself, wow, that's something to be impressed about. Those offensive linemen, they didn't play well, but at least they were working hard, right? But then you hear from Mike McDaniel that players were often late to meetings. They were often fined. Their behaviors didn't really change as a result of those fines. And it seems like Mike McDaniel painted himself as being a bit of a pushover. It seems like he tried to enforce some discipline in telling the players that they will be fined and then fining them. But did it change the behaviors? Did the fines do what they were supposed to do, make players show up to practice and show up to meetings on time? Apparently not. And it's a big problem for the team. The Dolphins really lacked the kind of discipline and leadership that they needed to be a Super Bowl contender. So as much as the Dolphins had problems and issues with staying healthy at key positions and also with the level of talent they have on the team, they have a coach that's coaching an undisciplined team. This team doesn't even show up to meetings on time. This team doesn't even work as hard as you think they do. They have a country club training camp. Players who are older, like Calais Campbell, who's in his late 30s, and Jordan Poyer, who's in his mid-30s, they want to come to Miami because they heard that it's a light training camp, that it's an easy camp for them. And for an older player, I guess that's what you want. You want like a kind of a Club Med kind of training camp. So Mike McDaniel has already established a reputation amongst the league that his practices in training camp are some of the lightest practices you'll ever see. Mike McDaniel tries to justify it by saying, well, we have a lot of mental reps and, we rather work more in the classroom than on the field. And, we want to do a little bit more in terms of processing the plays and, doing walkthroughs than actually hitting each other and actually making contact. And, it was an experiment to see if the Dolphins would finish the season strong and not sustain as much injuries. I think they were trying to do some load management in the preseason and training camp in order to keep the bodies fresh at the end of the year. But at the end of the day, it seemed like all it did was gave the players a green light to defy the coaches and defy authority and to really be undisciplined. And if you are a professional sports team in Miami, The last thing you need to have is an undisciplined team. There's so many things to do in Miami to be distracted from your job. You can't have a leadership group or a management group for a professional sports team with a bunch of millionaires on the roster and they have no discipline. I mean, it's a very challenging thing to get players to focus on their jobs when they have that much money and that much free time, but then when they're supposed to be at work, there's no discipline there, and there's no accountability, and players can do whatever they want to do. That's not a recipe for success at all. And I think we saw some of that late in the season for the Dolphins. Now, on the field, it seems like the Dolphins played hard. So, they probably weren't the most talented, but clearly it wasn't because of the lack of effort. But what you also seem to understand about this team is that they're not tough. And toughness doesn't come from just being tough, like hitting the guys harder than anybody else on the field. Toughness also comes with being mentally tough. And that's being disciplined. That's showing up on time. That's being accountable. That's showing up for your meetings and practicing as hard as you can. When you're not doing those things, when you have players like Tyreek Hill, who goes into the locker room, comes back out for practice in training camp, plays for a couple of plays, and then goes back into the locker room. I mean, you're not giving it your all. You're not playing your hardest. You're not trying your hardest. You're not practicing your hardest. And, that is the makeup of a soft team. And that's probably what guys like Jordan Poyer saw, guys like Jordan Brooks saw, guys like Jalen Ramsey saw. They saw these things all the way from training camp. These guys aren't disciplined. There's no accountability. Those guys don't train hard. They don't practice hard. They don't show up on time. How are you going to win a Super Bowl like that? Unless you have like the most talented team in the league. I'm talking about a dominant like 2000 Ravens defense, or a team that is almost impossible to beat. You're not going to become a Super Bowl contender with those kinds of practice behaviors and those kinds of habits. So it was very surprising to hear that from Mike McDaniel, that he has a team that's basically undisciplined. And he had an opportunity to talk to Tyreek Hill and find a way to mend the fences. And according to him, they don't have to make up. They talked about it. And he told them that basically it was unacceptable. And Mike McDaniel sounds like he's good with that. So we'll see if that's enough for the two, Mike McDaniel and Tyreek Hill, to come together. But, it sounds to me like, at least from what Mike McDaniel described, like, Tyreek Hill got off without, any kind of discipline, So as these things start to happen and continue to happen for the team, I don't know. Mike McDaniel has to do something different. This cannot continue for the Dolphins to be a successful team. And the fact that all of this stuff is coming out now, you have Chris Grier blaming the coaches. He's blaming the players for not being good enough, for not talented enough. He's blaming the coaches for not coaching well enough. Mike McDaniel is blaming the players for not showing up on meetings on time and not reacting correctly to his fines. I mean, it just seems like a lot of finger pointing, and, no one's really talking about the real issue here, which is making sure that this team is in well positioned to win a Super Bowl. No one's talking about the Tua hip injury. I guess they don't have to talk about injuries now that the season is over. But according to the reports, Tua has a muscle tear, or a tear in his hip. So if he has a muscle tear in his hip, maybe it heals on its own. But is it something that can rupture later on? Is it something that he might need surgery for? And if he doesn't, is that something that's going to affect his play? Chris Grier made it sound like Tua is responsible for protecting himself. And that brings me to the third thing that stood out to me about this press conference. I mean, here you are, Chris Grier. You draft a fragile quarterback, right? I mean, you knew he was injured when you drafted him. He had a history of being injured before you drafted him. And you drafted him injured. He had to rehab before he could even play. And even then, he couldn't start week 1, right? Because he still wasn't completely healthy from his hip surgery. And then he got into the game, and he wasn't really the same player that he was because he was just coming out of rehab. He didn't really get an opportunity to really get into the playbook and learn the playbook. So the first season for Tua was almost a lost season. It was almost like, some people call it a redshirt year, but that's what it felt like for Tua, right? he did get some game experience. He did get in there a couple of times and he did play as best as he could. But anyone who saw those games know that Tua wasn't prepared to play, not physically, not mentally. So that was a wasted year. But then Chris Grier says, well, not only does Tua have to protect himself better and be available, but we also have to do a better job providing protection for him on the offensive line. And it's going to be a point of emphasis. You don't provide him with a good enough offensive line, and then you don't get him a good enough backup. And then when the season is decided because your starting quarterback misses 6 games, you say, well, that's the reason why we've lost, because the quarterback wasn't available. But who put the Dolphins in this situation in the first place? Chris Grier drafted Tua. Chris Grier failed to protect him, and Chris Grier didn't get him an adequate backup quarterback. So for him to say, well, Tua needs to be available is just giving a part of the story. Part of the story is Tua's injury history, yes, but the other part of it is that he's not adequately protected. And yes, those injuries that he had, at least one of them, you can tell with the concussion, it was something that Tua did. With the other thing with the hip, he was kind of scrambling for yards. I mean, people presuming that was the play that he got hit on the hip with the helmet, and that might have caused the injury. But, I don't think that any clarity was really provided on when the injury took place. But either way, it seemed like those 2 injuries took place with Tua doing things outside the pocket. But Tua wants to be a football player, right? He wants to make plays. He wants to help his team win. This is what you got when you drafted a guy, the number 5 pick overall in the draft. So he wants to be competitive, but you drafted a competitive player who's fragile. You drafted an offensive line that could not protect him. You also did not get him a good enough backup in order for him to survive, the team to survive the season in the event the fragile quarterback got hurt. So to blame Tua or to blame the offensive line when you failed to provide whatever means it was to keep the team on a pace to win the Super Bowl, it's laughable to me. And I mean, that's probably the biggest takeaway that I got from the press conference. And on X, I saw people actually justifying it, saying, well, how many core teams can survive missing 6 games without their starting quarterback? And I'm like, well, who put the team in that position in the first place? You have a fragile quarterback, a bad offensive line, and no backup quarterback. What can go wrong? It's like you could see this coming a mile away. And it's not like Tua's never been injured before. He's only had 1 healthy season in the NFL. So the fact that Chris Grier believes that the fans can not see through his nonsense is just laughable to me. But honestly, on Twitter, on X, I saw some people say it. It's like, well, hey, we can't, teams can't win Super Bowls with their quarterbacks going down. And I said to one guy on Twitter, I said, hey, listen, J.J. McCarthy was lost for the season in the preseason. The backup quarterback, Sam Darnold, went 14-3. So let's not make it sound like these things can't happen. Teams have won Super Bowls when they've lost their starting quarterback. The Miami Dolphins did it in the 1970s, and I know that's a long time ago, but they did it. But they're not the only ones. Kurt Warner won a Super Bowl after Trent Green went down in the preseason. The Rams won a Super Bowl. Phil Simms went down, and Jeff Hostetler won the Super Bowl. There's been other instances where starting quarterbacks have gone down and backup quarterbacks have won Super Bowls. Look at Carson Wentz. He was a starting quarterback for the Eagles. He went down. He missed some games. And then Nick Foles came in there and won a Super Bowl. So let's not make it sound like backup quarterbacks don't matter. Jimmy Johnson once said the backup quarterback is the second most important player in the team. But it doesn't seem like this Dolphin regime looks at it that way. So we'll see what happens going forward. But this press conference didn't exactly instill a lot of confidence in me, in the regime going forward, but I'm trying to be optimistic that somehow these guys will find a way to get lucky and, maybe it can provide some level of success for the team in 2025. But that's it for this video. If you like this video, leave a comment and hit the like button. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.